Single dad security guard saved the company from a cyber attack. What the CEO said was unthinkable. This port shouldn't be open. Ethan Cole stared at the flickering terminal screen in the dim glow of the server room. The fan hummed louder than usual. A chill climbed up his spine, not from the cold, but from instinct, the kind that never dulled even after years away from the field. He stepped back, wiped his palms on his faded security uniform, and looked around the sterile hallway of Hardcore Technologies headquarters. Clean. Too clean. No IT staff, no movement. Just him, fluorescent lights, and a port that should have been silent. He leaned into his radio. Cole, Sector 4, found an anomaly in Server 3, requesting callback. Silence. He tried again. Ops come in, still nothing. Dead radio. Ethan turned back to the terminal. Port 80 was active, pulsing like a heartbeat. Not standard at this hour, especially not on this air-gapped node. Then he saw it a quick line of outbound activity. Encrypted, compressed, unusual. He didn't panic. Panic was for people who hadn't lost everything yet. He tapped a few keys, careful, methodical. Disabled the port, disconnected the line. Left no trace but a note in the physical logbook. 2:14 a.m. Disconnected port 80 from node 3 due to abnormal traffic. Possible misconfiguration. EC. Then he stepped away. Not a word to anyone. By morning, New York hummed its usual tired song. Cabs shouted through traffic. Office windows blinked awake. Ethan stood by the coffee machine in the back of the security lounge, sipping burnt drip coffee from a paper cup that said, "We appreciate you," in fading ink. Across from him sat Manny, younger, louder, and half as alert. "You still doing those midnight laps, old man?" Manny grinned, feet kicked up on the desk. "I walk, you sleep. We both earn the same paycheck." "Fair trade," Ethan replied without looking. Manny chuckled. "Damn. You always got a quote. I swear you were a poet in another life." Ethan sipped again. "Just tired of repeating myself." The door clicked. The room fell silent. In walked a woman no one expected to see in person, especially not in this part of the building. Julia Hart, CEO. The kind of woman you read about in business magazines, sharp jawline, hair always in control presence like frost on glass. No makeup out of place. No emotion wasted. Manny nearly knocked over his coffee. "Miss Hart. Ma'am. Is there a problem?" She didn't even glance at him. Her eyes locked on Ethan. "You're Cole." Ethan stood straighter. "Yes, ma'am. You filed a physical anomaly report at 2:14 this morning. Why I noticed an open port on server node 3. Logged it. Disconnected it." Her gaze sharpened. "Did you document your steps?" "Only in the logbook. Didn't access the system directly." A pause. "You have a background in networking." "No, ma'am," Ethan said. "I have a background in watching things break before anyone notices." "That's all." A flicker passed through her face. Not quite surprise. Maybe curiosity. Or maybe she simply didn't expect resistance from someone in a 12-an-hour uniform. She stepped closer. "Who told you to interfere?" No one, Ethan said. But someone should have. That landed. Julia didn't blink. Her voice dropped an octave. "What exactly did you see enough to know it didn't belong? And not enough to know how deep it goes. But I saw a data stream pushing outbound. Small packet. Compressed. Disguised. Could it have been routine? If it were routine, you wouldn't be here asking a janitor in a security vest about it." Julia's lips tightened. Another pause. Then she turned to leave, but not before saying almost too quietly, "Next time, Mr. Cole, call me first." Ethan stood for a long moment after she left. He wasn't sure if that was a warning, a compliment, or a threat. Maybe all three. Manny was wide-eyed. "Dude, what the hell just happened?" Ethan didn't answer. He just looked at the hallway where she'd disappeared. Because whatever just happened, it wasn't routine. That night, Ethan picked up his daughter Grace from her aftercare program. She was waiting on the curb with her backpack half-zipped legs swinging. 7 years old. Too smart for her own good. "Hey, Dad," she said as she climbed in. "Did you know cats have more bones than humans?" Ethan smiled. "Not surprised. They never listen to anyone." She giggled. "Miss Allen says I ask too many questions." "That's a good thing," Ethan said. "One day someone will be glad you ask the right one." They drove home in silence for a while. Then Grace asked, "Was Mommy someone who noticed things too?" Ethan's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Yeah," he said softly. "She noticed everything." Back in the apartment, Ethan laid out his notes from the night before. He couldn't shake the feeling. That port hadn't just been open, it had been bleeding. He wasn't supposed to know what he knew. But years in the NSA didn't just fade, and paranoia wasn't always a flaw. It was sometimes the only reason people stayed alive. He opened his encrypted drive buried in an old Linux shell and ran a packet filter, just to see if the traffic pattern matched anything in his archived blacklists. It did. It matched an old signature he'd seen in Ankara in 2016. Industrial Exfiltration Protocol, masked as a routine maintenance ping. No ordinary IT guy would catch it. But he wasn't ordinary, and neither was whoever planted it. Ethan leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed, heart pacing but not racing. He didn't know who he was up against, but he knew one thing: this wasn't over. And whatever this was, it had just begun. Trust isn't something I invest in easily, especially when the numbers are about to go public. Julia Hart didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. In the vast, glass-paneled conference room that overlooked Manhattan's skyline, her presence said enough. She stood still, arms crossed, spine straight like a line of code that never broke. The room was filled with department heads and lawyers in tailored suits. No one dared interrupt. She turned to Russell, the head of cybersecurity, who looked visibly tense. "You're telling me that a building security guard discovered a potential breach, and your team missed it entirely." Russell cleared his throat. "To be fair, Ms. Hart, he didn't follow protocol. He disconnected a port manually and didn't file a digital report. We only found out when facilities logged the incident." Julia walked to the window. Rain tapped faintly against the glass. "Would you like to guess what the headline would be if this gets out?" she said without turning. "Tech Giant's IPO threatened by janitor's discovery of security breach." The room was silent. She turned back. This company was built on one thing: control. We control systems, we control risk, and, most of all, we control the narrative. Russell tried again. "We've run diagnostics. No further anomalies have shown. We believe it was a one-off artifact." Julia's stare was cold. Belief doesn't stop breaches. Evidence does. A pause. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Find him. I want to speak with him myself." Julia hated being wrong. She hated that Ethan Cole's name had appeared on her radar, that he had noticed something her high-salaried, Ivy-educated engineers hadn't. She hated that in a building of 500 people, the only one who'd shown initiative was the one who didn't even have a desk. But more than all of that, she hated how familiar that made her feel. Back in her office, she poured herself a black coffee, no cream, no sugar. The kind her father used to drink back when the company still had his name on it. Before the scandal, before the headlines. She stared out at the city, her reflection barely visible in the rain-drenched glass. Her phone buzzed. Lucas, her longtime executive assistant, poked his head in. "He's downstairs." "Do you want to bring him up?" "No," Julia said. "I'll go down." Lucas blinked. "You sure? I don't like looking down at people unless I'm absolutely certain they deserve it." The elevator ride was silent. When the doors opened into the security lounge, she stepped out like a ghost in a glass cathedral. Ethan was seated reading a paperback copy of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He looked up, not startled, just aware. She noted that. "Mr. Cole," she said. He stood. "Ms. Hart." You read philosophy. I read anything that reminds me not everything needs fixing with a wrench. She allowed the corner of her lip to twitch almost a smile. May I? He gestured to the empty chair. It's your building. She sat, crossed her legs, leaned in. Do you always act without permission? Ethan met her eyes. Only when silence costs more than the trouble it causes. Interesting philosophy, she said. Tell me what you saw. No embellishments, just the facts. Ethan laid it out, the unusual port, the outbound packet, the compressed format, the traffic pattern that didn't belong. No dramatics, just precision. When he finished, she didn't speak right away. Finally, she said, You said earlier that watching things break is your background. Care to elaborate? No, ma'am, Ethan replied. But I'll say this. Systems don't fail overnight. People just stop noticing the cracks. That one hit. Julia stood smoothing her coat. Thank you, Mr. Cole. You've been unexpectedly helpful. He tilted his head. That a compliment or a warning? It's an observation. She turned to leave, then stopped. You were right. That port shouldn't have been open. Ethan didn't move. And I don't like being blindsided, which is why I'm not ignoring this. But I suggest you stay in your lane until asked otherwise. Ethan nodded, and if the cracks keep showing up in my lane, Julia turned back her eyes like cold steel. Then I hope you're prepared to carry more than just a flashlight. That night, the rain came harder. Ethan sat at the kitchen table. Grace asleep in the next room, her drawings still scattered across the counter rocket ships a giraffe with a cape stick figures holding hands. He stared at his notes. Packet traces, signature timestamps. Something about it felt rehearsed, deliberate, like someone inside the company had been hoping no one would be looking. And maybe if not for a sleepless night and an old habit he couldn't shake, no one would have. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He let it ring once, twice, then answered. A voice low-sharp, intentional. You've seen too much already. I suggest you forget what you didn't understand, for your sake, and your daughter's. Click. Ethan sat still for a long moment. Then slowly, with frightening clarity, he whispered aloud, They just made this personal. The letter had yellowed with time, but Ethan kept it in the back of his sock drawer, folded, frayed at the edges, fragile like a prayer half answered. We're sorry for your loss, Mr. Cole. After internal review, the agency has determined that no disciplinary action will be taken. The procedural deviation was deemed non-malicious. We regret any distress this situation may have caused. He read it again that morning after the call. It still rang as hollow as the day he first held it. He folded it back with care, slipped it into its envelope, and tucked it away like old grief. Down the hallway, Grace was humming while brushing her teeth some silly song about flamingos. Innocent, unaware, unscarred. He wanted to keep it that way. By noon, Ethan was sitting on a bench outside a free clinic thumbing through his daughter's insurance portal on his old phone. There it was. Medical history updated. Mild cardiac murmur. Unverified. His brows drew together. Grace had no cardiac issue. None. He'd seen this before. Once, long ago, when he flagged a similar alteration on a patient at the NSA's partner contractor hospital, they told him it was a clerical error. 3 weeks later, a woman died on an operating table because a medication was contraindicated for a condition she didn't actually have. That woman was his wife. The next stop was the public library. Not because he needed books, but because it was the only place he trusted to run searches without being traced. VPN. Encrypted queries. Public terminals. The results came in slow but steady. There was a match. The outbound packet he'd blocked it didn't just mirror data structures. It mirrored medical claim protocols, specifically claim amendments, the kind used in insurance fraud, and medical identity laundering. Not wide-scale, targeted, precise. Ethan leaned back, eyes narrowing. They weren't stealing money. They were rewriting people. Later that night, Grace was working on a solar system diagram at the table. "Daddy," she asked, "do you think Pluto's sad because people stopped calling it a planet?" Ethan looked at her glue stick in one hand, stars on her cheek. "No," he said. "I think Pluto's still doing its job whether anyone notices or not." She smiled. "Like you." He chuckled softly. "Something like that." But inside, something twisted. The kind of twist a man feels when he knows a storm is coming but no one else sees the clouds yet. That same evening, Ethan sat in his apartment long after Grace had gone to bed. The lights were off. Only the screen of his old laptop glowed blue in the dark like a watchful eye. He pulled up the trace log again. There, a digital fingerprint. Masked, yes, but sloppily. Someone hadn't expected a janitor with NSA clearance-level tools at home. He ran a silent trace upstream and got a hit. An internal extension. Hardcore. Executive level. IP ending in 91. Not IT. Not accounting. Executive support. That was when he knew. Lucas. Always in the background. Always polite. The kind of man who holds the elevator, remembers your coffee order, and empties your life without ever raising his voice. The next day, Ethan approached a man he hadn't spoken to in 3 years. Micah Tran. Once a fellow analyst. Now working freelance cyber forensics. They met at a small diner on the Lower East Side. "Didn't expect your call," Micah said over pancakes. "Thought you ghosted the world." "I tried," Ethan said. "But ghosts don't get warning calls." Micah leaned in. "This about Grace?" Ethan nodded. Micah's tone shifted. "Then you came to the right place." Ethan passed him a thumb drive. "Can you confirm what I think it is?" Micah looked at it, then at him. "You're not going to like the answer." "Try me." "It's not just identity laundering," Micah said. "It's predictive manipulation. Someone's editing health histories to increase insurance premiums on people statistically unlikely to notice until it's too late. Who's running it?" Micah's jaw clenched. If it's who I think it is, it's not just someone inside. It's someone who knows exactly what the company's about to be worth. Ethan stared at the window. "They're dressing the company up for the IPO," he said. "And gutting people on the back end," Micah finished. A long silence passed. Then Micah asked quietly, "You gonna bring this to the FBI?" Ethan shook his head. "Not yet." Micah frowned. Why, Ethan's eyes didn't waver. "Because last time I did the right thing, my wife died and the government mailed me an apology. This time, I'm going to do it differently." That night, Ethan returned home to find a letter on his doormat. No stamp, no return address. Inside, a single sentence. "People who fix things tend to break easily. Watch yourself." He folded the note and looked out the window. The skyline blinked like a lie wrapped in neon. He thought of Grace, of Julia, of Lucas, and of a voice inside him that had gone quiet for too long. You either stay silent and lose what matters, or speak and risk it all. Ethan knew what came next, not because he wanted to, but because someone had rewritten his daughter's future, and he was the only one who knew how to restore the original version. The rain had stopped, but the streets still shimmered like bruised glass beneath the city lights. Ethan stood on the rooftop of the Hardcore building, a place no one visited after hours except birds and regrets. In one hand, he held a notebook filled with scribbled timestamps and IP traces. In the other, an old audio recorder from his NSA days, worn but precise. Below him, the world moved as if nothing was wrong. That was the dangerous part. Evil rarely screams. It whispers. By 3:27 a.m., he was in the sub-basement again, an area few employees even knew existed. Old wiring, rusted conduit, a perfect place to bury secrets. He opened a hatch and plugged into a dormant diagnostic port. Not the mainframe, too visible. This was old infrastructure predating cloud-based anything. Hardwired, quiet, forgotten, just like him. He typed, executed a protocol from memory, and watched the log populate. There it was again. Outbound pings, patterned, timed, masked under automated HVAC diagnostics. They were smart. They had buried the signal inside a system that was supposed to be noisy. But they made one mistake. They didn't think anyone still listened. Morning broke cold and silent. Julia Hart walked into the 40th floor boardroom, coffee in hand heels echoing like a metronome of control. Her hair, as always, was perfectly pinned, her face unreadable. The boardroom table was full legal compliance IPO advisors. Lucas leaned close. Cyber team sent another clean report. No anomalies. She nodded, sipped. But something itched. A thought she couldn't quite name. She looked toward the digital dashboard showing investor sentiment news chatter IPO projections. All green, yet she felt none of it. Later that day, Julia entered her office and paused. On her desk sat a manila envelope with no markings. No name. Just a sticky note. "You said to call you first. This is me calling. EC." She stared at it, debated shredding it, debated rage. Instead, she opened it and pulled out a single USB. She connected it to an air-gapped terminal. Paranoid, maybe? But in her world, caution wasn't a flaw. It was insurance. A command line window appeared. Audio began to play. Redacted call log timestamp 2:14 a.m. Pattern matches medical data stream. Packet consistent with prior case signature NSA trace Ankara 2016. Recommendation escalate to internal authority. Do not suppress. Source potentially internal. She sat still as the final line played. "If I'm wrong, I'll clean the floors until I retire. If I'm right, you've got something rotten in your walls." Julia closed the window. She didn't breathe for a moment. Then she picked up her phone. "Russell, bring me the internal trace logs from the last 5 days. No filters. Raw only." A pause, and Russell, "Do not delegate this." That evening, as the building thinned out, Julia stepped into the elevator alone. But when the doors opened on level B2, she wasn't surprised to see Ethan waiting. "I was told you'd be here," he said calmly, hands in pockets. "Some places don't show up on the company map." She stepped out. "You left a note." "That's bold. I figured a memo would get lost in translation." They walked side by side, the fluorescent hallway humming above them. "I listened to the recording," she said. "You referenced Ankara." He nodded. 2016. A facility in Turkey. Someone tried to reroute biometric identities to steal organ matches. They used HVAC pings to mask their trail. And this feels the same. Ethan stopped, looked at her. "It feels worse. Because this time the system isn't being fooled. It's being fed." A beat passed. The kind that carries the weight of understanding. Julia crossed her arms. "You think someone inside is rerouting claim data to inflate valuation pre-IPO. I think someone is rewriting lives for margin points," Ethan said, "and they're counting on everyone being too busy, too proud, or too scared to notice. And you." "Which are you?" he answered without pause. "I'm the guy who buried his wife after a system like this didn't get stopped in time. I don't have room left for fear." Julia studied him. There was no performance in his voice, just gravity. "Why didn't you go public leak it?" He met her eyes. "Because once I did the right thing and lost everything. This time I want to be sure who I'm fighting with before I start the war." She looked away, then said almost to herself, "Sometimes what we build to protect us ends up protecting what's broken." Later, back in her office, Julia stared at the Heartcore logo on her glass wall, clean white modern, but she saw it now for what it might be, a mask. Lucas entered without knocking. "You wanted the trace logs." She nodded. "Put them on the secure drive." "And Lucas?" He turned. She paused, watching him carefully. Double-check the timestamps. Any gaps? Any anomalies? Lucas's smile was polite, measured. "I already did, Julia. Everything's clean." Then he left, and something in her blood ran cold. Down in the sub-basement, Ethan listened to the recording again, but this time he filtered for background frequencies. A faint double-tap click followed by a humming pattern. It wasn't part of the server. It was someone's keystrokes. Encrypted commands. Remote execution. He'd been right, but he was also too late, because the signal had already moved, and now they were hunting in real time. The wind that night felt different. It wasn't loud or cold, it was quiet, measured. The kind of wind that made you listen, not shiver. Ethan stood on the balcony of his apartment, his hands resting on the rail, his eyes on the city's glow. Grace was asleep. The stars above were blurred by city haze, but one glimmered through. He wasn't sure what bothered him more, the encrypted keystrokes buried in the HVAC logs or Lucas's smile when Julia asked about the timestamps. Everything's clean. Clean was often code for already swept. The next morning, Ethan arrived at Hardcore early. Too early. The guards nodded without speaking. They knew him, quiet, reliable, invisible. Just another man who walked the hallways when everyone else was still asleep. But today, Ethan wasn't here to sweep floors. He took the back elevator to B2, the sub-basement, and slipped into a side panel he had unlocked the night before. Behind it, a small terminal node tied directly to the archival backup systems. Outdated, untouched, perfect. He ran the trace log again. This time he went deeper packet layer, metadata, internal command paths, command origin device HRT-EX91, registered user Lucas H. Wallace. There it was, unmistakable. He exhaled. You always expect betrayal to feel loud, he thought. But it's the quiet that breaks you. He downloaded the logs onto a secure thumb drive, encrypted it under a dual-key system, one part on him, one part off-site, and made his way back up. Julia was in her office, standing at the far window, arms folded. The skyline glistened behind her like a crown she no longer believed she'd earned. She turned as Ethan entered unannounced. "You have something," she said before he spoke. "I do," he replied, handing her the drive. She inserted it into her secure terminal. As the data loaded, Ethan watched her carefully. He wanted to see the moment she recognized what he already knew. The screen lit up, and then she saw it. Lines of code, timestamps, and at the bottom, executed by Lucas H. Wallace. Julia went still. Her jaw tightened. Then she whispered, barely audible, "He held my mother's hand at the funeral. He helped me write my first board speech. I trusted him when I couldn't even trust myself." Ethan didn't speak. What could you say when someone realized the person who stood beside them had always stood behind them too? With a knife, Julia sat slowly like her legs had forgotten how to carry her weight. "Is it definitive?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "Yes," Ethan said. "It's him." That evening, Julia asked Lucas to stay late. The boardroom was empty. Just the two of them. Across the table, a familiar distance suddenly full of landmines. "I need to talk to you." Julia began, her voice calm. Too calm. Lucas smiled, that same professional measured smile. "Of course." "What's on your mind?" She placed a printout on the table between them. Packet logs, access timestamps, command sources. Lucas's eyes flickered, just for a second, then returned to stillness. "You've been busy," he said gently. "So have you," Julia replied. Lucas leaned back, fingers interlocked. "You always did underestimate me, even when you relied on me." "No," Julia said softly. "I didn't underestimate you. I trusted you." "That's worse." He tilted his head almost affectionately. "I never meant to hurt you." "You didn't," she said. "You hurt the company, the people, the integrity we spent 10 years trying to rebuild." Lucas's expression hardened. "Integrity doesn't pay dividends, Julia. Not in this world." "Then maybe this world needs fewer people like you in it," she said coldly. Lucas's eyes narrowed. "You go public with this, you lose everything. The IPO dies. The board will bury you. You know that. I do. Then why are you doing this?" She stood slowly. "Because someone finally reminded me what it looks like when the right thing costs something." She pressed a button beneath the table. Security entered. "Mr. Wallace," she said, her voice sharp, "now your access is revoked effective immediately. You're under investigation for internal sabotage and federal-level data fraud. Please cooperate." Lucas didn't fight. He just smiled again, that same unbearable smile. "You really think you can come out of this clean?" he whispered as they cuffed him. "You think they'll let you?" Julia didn't answer. She didn't need to. She was already thinking about what came next. That night she called Ethan. He picked up on the first ring. "I need a walk," she said. "Meet you in 20. They met on the High Line, walking slow beneath the fading gold of street lamps. She didn't speak for a long while. Neither did he. Finally, she asked, "Why didn't you say, 'I told you so'?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Because I didn't want to be right." She stopped walking, turned to him. "I built this company to be the opposite of what destroyed my father's, and all I did was repaint the same walls with better branding." He looked at her eyes, kind but firm. "No, you stood up when it counted. That's the difference." She held his gaze. And for the first time in years, Julia Hart looked tired, but not broken, softened, but not weak. She nodded. "There's more to do." "There always is," he said. "But now, you're not alone." The headlines broke before sunrise. Hardcore IPO suspended amid internal sabotage allegations. Insider fraud, Roxtech Giants security division. CEO Julia Hart faces internal revolt after shocking arrest of longtime aide. Ethan didn't need the TV to know the storm had landed. He saw it in the faces of the guards when he walked in, saw it in the eyes that turned toward him not with suspicion but something closer to awe or caution, as if a man who once mopped floors had become something more dangerous, or maybe finally visible. He clocked in without a word. Across the city, Julia Hart sat alone in a conference room that had once held the weight of a billion-dollar future. Now it held silence, and the thick metallic taste of consequence. She stared at the empty chair where Lucas had once sat, still couldn't quite believe it. She had grown up trusting frameworks, trusting order, trusting that if she followed every rule and controlled every outcome, the world would reciprocate. It didn't. Not when her father was forced out, not when her mother passed alone in a hospice because a nurse missed a time code, not when she gave everything to a man who smiled through betrayal. Now, all she had left was clarity, and a name she hadn't stopped thinking about since last night. By noon, she was standing outside Ethan Cole's door. The apartment was small, tucked into a second-floor walk-up with a squeaky banister and peeling paint. A place that said, "We get by." Ethan opened the door eyes unsurprised. "I figured you'd come," he said, stepping aside. She entered, slowly taking in the space. Neat, simple, lived in. On the wall, Grace's crayon drawings, rocket ships, stars a picture of her and her dad hand in hand. Julia stared at it for a long time. "She drew that the night you called," Ethan said it was for when I finally looked up again. Julia nodded, swallowing something that wasn't coffee. "I came here," she said softly, "because I needed to understand something." He waited. She turned to face him. "How do you survive a system that breaks you without becoming like it?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Then he walked to a drawer, pulled out a folded letter, and handed it to her. She opened it. Read the cold, bureaucratic apology for the death of his wife. Her hand trembled. Her eyes did not. Ethan said quietly, "I didn't survive it. Not really. I just kept walking until something mattered more than what I'd lost." He looked toward the bedroom where Grace slept. "She's my proof that the world's still worth protecting, even when it's broken." Julia sat at his kitchen table, the letter still in her hand. "I spent years designing systems to protect data," she said, "but I never asked who was protecting the people behind it." "That's where you went wrong," Ethan said. "You tried to protect everything but yourself." She looked up, and now he paused, then said simply, "Now you build something that can't be corrupted. Not because it's perfect, but because it's honest. 2 weeks passed. The world spun with scandal. The board suspended Julia pending a review. Investors panicked. The IPO faded like a rumor. But something else began. Quietly, under the radar, Julia sold her shares. Not all, just enough to start something new. She called it Safe House. Not a startup, not a foundation, a concept, a classroom in a former warehouse, a network of volunteers. Ethan at the heart of it. They trained teenagers on cyberethics, helped underserved kids understand how the systems that tracked them also needed them. They built digital literacy programs, spoke at schools, brought in retired engineers and old NSA hands. No branding, no cameras, just rebuilding trust. One human at a time. One afternoon, as the first group of students logged off for the day, Julia stood in the back of the room watching Ethan help a 12-year-old reset a hacked tablet. Grace sat nearby, drawing again. This time, it was a big red shield with the word Dad in the middle. Julia smiled. Ethan walked over. "You stayed," he said. "I wanted to see the end of the lesson. You're a little overdressed for this neighborhood." She smirked. "Some habits die harder than others." He nodded toward the kids. "They don't need polish. They need someone who sees them." She grew quiet. Then, "You know what scares me most?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That if this works," she said, "it still won't fix what I broke." Ethan looked at her for a long time, then said, "It's not about fixing what's broken. It's about proving something better can be built where it fell." Julia blinked. Once, then nodded. Later that night, when she returned to her car, she found a note on her dashboard. From Grace. "Thank you for not giving up on my dad. He didn't know he was still someone worth showing up for." Beneath it, a single crayon heart. Julia closed her eyes, the paper trembling slightly in her hands, and for the first time in years, she cried. Not for loss, but for what had survived it. "You always said transparency was the currency of trust, Julia. So why are we bleeding trust right now?" The boardroom was full. Men and women in dark suits sipping bitter coffee and speaking in polished, practiced tones. But behind every sentence was the same silent question. Can she still lead? Julia stood at the head of the long table, not flinching. Not hiding. "I won't defend what happened," she said, her voice steady. "But I will say this, we uncovered a rot because someone outside this room chose not to look away." The murmurs came instantly. A janitor, a security guard. "He didn't go through protocol." Julia raised a hand. They quieted. "Maybe that's the problem," she said, locking eyes with each of them. "Maybe our protocols have become so insulated, so proud, that we stopped listening to the people who still remember what right and wrong feels like." A pause. One of the oldest board members, Elliot Shaw, leaned forward. "You understand that our stock is in free fall, yes, that our IPO window is closed, possibly for good." "I do. And yet, Shaw said you brought this on yourself. You chose to detonate it." "I chose not to lie," Julia replied. "That may not be the safest choice, but it's still the right one." Shaw leaned back displeased. A younger woman, Lana Chen, spoke next. "And what now? You want us to rebuild around an idea instead of revenue." Julia nodded slowly. "I want us to rebuild around people. The revenue will come, but only if we can look ourselves in the mirror when it does." After the meeting, Julia stepped into the hallway alone. Her hands were trembling, but her eyes were clearer than they had been in years. That's when she heard a voice behind her. "I didn't think you'd actually say it." She turned. Ethan stood there. Plain jacket, quiet presence, but something in him felt heavier now, not burdened, but resolved. "You watched?" she asked. "Wasn't invited. But the guards by the AV room don't know how to argue with a man carrying a busted HDMI cable." Julia chuckled almost despite herself. "I meant every word she said. I know he said. And they'll fight you for it." She looked at him searching. "Tell me honestly, Ethan, do you think I can come back from this?" He didn't hesitate. Only if you stop trying to come back and start trying to move forward. She stared at him a moment, then nodded. You want to ride back to the safe house? He shrugged. Grace says your car smells like grapefruit. She's a fan. They rode in silence for a few minutes before Julia asked, have you ever had to forgive someone who didn't ask for it? Ethan watched the city blur past the windows. My father, he said finally. Left when I was 6. Came back once when I was 17. Never said sorry. Just asked if I still liked baseball. Julia didn't speak. I forgave him anyway, Ethan continued. Not because he earned it, but because I didn't want to carry him with me. Forgiveness isn't about who deserves it. It's about who you want to be without it. She nodded the words, pressing into something inside her she hadn't realized was still sore. That night, Ethan checked the locks at Safe House. Double-checked the servers. Old habits. Then he found Grace sitting on the floor cutting shapes from construction paper. What are you making? He asked. It's a thank you card, she said. For Miss Hart. He raised a brow. What's it say? Grace flipped it around. It was drawn like a building with people inside and hearts on the windows. On top, a single sentence in bright purple crayon. You made a place where the quiet people can be loud again. Ethan swallowed hard. He sat beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. You're getting good at this, he said. Grace grinned. I learned from you. Meanwhile, across town, Julia returned home to find an envelope slipped under her door. No return address, no markings, just a printed message on expensive stationery. Congratulations on your principals. You just cost your shareholders $480 million. We'll be watching your next move. So will the rest of the industry. No signature, no threat, just pressure. The quiet kind that turns steel into fractures. She stared at it for a long moment, then tore it in half, then into quarters, then into nothing. The next morning, Julia called an emergency press briefing. She stood at the podium without makeup, without polish. Just herself. We made mistakes, she said, and we paid for them. A pause. But we also found something more valuable than valuation. We found the courage to stop lying, even to ourselves. She announced the launch of a public ethics initiative. She named Ethan Cole publicly for the first time, not as a whistleblower, but as a builder. He reminded us that integrity doesn't come from systems. It comes from people. And it's time we started listening to them again. Some applauded, some didn't. But for the first time, Julia didn't care about the outcome. Only the direction. That night, Ethan found a note tucked into his locker. From Julia. If there's ever a day when you think no one's watching, I still am. Thank you for saving something I forgot was worth saving. The sky broke open at dawn. It wasn't the kind of rain that whispered on windows. It pounded urgent, relentless. The kind that turned sidewalks into rivers and city streets into war zones of noise. But inside the safe house, it was quiet. Ethan watched through the window, coffee in hand, watching the water bead against the glass like time refusing to move forward. Behind him, Grace stirred under a blanket on the couch, her hair a golden tangle. She looked up groggily. Is it still raining? Yeah, Ethan said. Looks like the sky needed a good cry. She yawned. Will they still come today? The kids? I don't know, he admitted. Grace blinked slowly. You'll come anyway, though, right? He nodded. You always show up when it matters, even if no one else does. That's your thing. By noon, the inbox was full. Julia sat alone in her apartment, hair still damp from the storm eyes scanning the flood of headlines and shareholder emails. Hardcore CEO defiant amidst fallout. Ethics, or ego, Hart's stance divides industry. Market confidence plummets. The board had called for a closed-door emergency session. The tone in their messages was clear. This was the price. All the speeches, all the honesty, none of it buffered the bottom line. And now, the ones who had always applauded her decisiveness were sharpening their knives in private. Her phone buzzed. Lucas, from County Holding. She let it ring out. Then it buzzed again. Unknown. Caller, she answered, a woman's voice, stern, measured. Ms. Hart, I represent several former investors in Hardcore. You've become a liability and a symbol. We don't tolerate either. Click. Julia set the phone down. Her hands were still dry. Her heart wasn't racing. She wasn't afraid. She was just done. That evening, the boardroom was filled again, this time with tighter lips and colder eyes. Julia entered alone. No legal team, no assistant, just a single manila folder tucked under her arm. Elliot Shaw gestured for her to sit. Ms. Hart, he began. We've reviewed your latest press conference and the subsequent investor reaction. It's troubling. Julia nodded. It was meant to be. He blinked. Excuse me. She placed the folder on the table and slid it forward. Inside, copies of every altered medical profile Lucas had rerouted, complete with logs and receipts. Over 50 cases. This is what we allowed to happen under our roof, she said. We packaged it up and tied a bow on it for Wall Street. Elliot's tone grew sharp. And you're admitting this publicly. Do you understand what you're risking? Yes, Julia said. I'm risking the lie. I've lived in it long enough. The room quieted. Lana Chen leaned in, voice low. What exactly are you proposing? Julia stood. You don't need a scapegoat. You need a spine. And if you don't have one, you can take mine. I resign effective immediately. Gasps, whispered curses, a few sighs of relief, and one long silence. Then she added, but don't think I'm leaving in shame. I'm walking away because I finally remembered who I was before I learned how to win the wrong way. She turned heels, silent against the carpet, and didn't look back. At the safe house, the rain was still falling. Only 3 students had come soaked to the bone shoes, squeaking on the tile. Ethan sat on the floor with them wires and devices spread out like a battlefield of ideas. One kid, Luis, a lanky 12-year-old with sharp eyes, asked, "What if we mess it up?" Ethan smiled. "Then you learn, and you fix it, and the next time you don't mess it up as bad." Luis frowned. "But what if it breaks for real?" Ethan thought of servers of systems of promises made and broken. Then he answered, "Sometimes things have to break before we remember how to build them better." Julia stood quietly at the entrance watching. She had walked here in the storm. No driver, no umbrella, just purpose. Grace ran to her and hugged her legs like she'd always belonged. "You came back," Grace said. Julia smiled, soft and tired. "You saved me a seat." Ethan looked up. "Didn't know if you'd still want one." She sat beside him on the floor, unbothered by the cables, the mess, the chaos. Turns out the floor's exactly where I needed to start. That night, Ethan closed up while Julia wiped down the whiteboards with Grace. He found a note taped to the server room door. Scrawled in messy handwriting, "Don't quit." "We just got here." He smiled. Back in the main room, Julia was reading aloud to Grace. Not from a storybook, but from a safe house training manual. Grace was wide-eyed. Julia glanced up at Ethan. "I think she's going to be our youngest mentor." "She already mentors me," Ethan said. They shared a long, quiet look. Not romance yet. Not resolution. But something better. Recognition. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Not with thunder, but with stillness. And for the first time in months, the world didn't feel like it was falling apart. It felt like it had been stripped down to what mattered most. Truth. Trust. And a place worth protecting, even when no one's watching. It started small, like most revolutions do. A broken laptop donated by a grocery clerk. A whiteboard salvaged from a defunct real estate office. A folding table, 6 mismatched chairs, and 1 beat-up coffee machine that coughed before it brewed. The safe house wasn't impressive on the outside. It was tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop, its sign hand-painted by a 15-year-old with a dream and shaky hands. But inside, something was happening. And this time, it wasn't about code. It was about character. Can I tell you something, Mr. Ethan Lewis, the sharp-eyed boy who used to mumble through every lesson, leaned across the table whispering like they were exchanging national secrets. I taught my mom how to reset our Wi-Fi. Ethan grinned, arms crossed, proud. That's serious power right there. Louise beamed. She said I should teach her other stuff too, like how to make her email not look like a Christmas tree exploded. Ethan laughed. You're already a teacher, kid. Just don't start charging her tuition. The room was buzzing. Not with noise, but with energy. Laptops clicking, marker pens squeaking across whiteboards, a dozen kids discovering that they weren't invisible, they were indispensable. At the center of it all was Ethan. Calm, steady, listening more than he spoke, but when he did, it stuck. The real firewall isn't software. It's knowing when to say no, even if it costs you. A broken rule isn't always a broken value, but a broken conscience. That's harder to patch. His lessons weren't technical. They were spiritual in disguise. And the kids, they ate it up. Across the room, Julia stood watching, clipboard in hand, though she hadn't written anything in 20 minutes. She was too caught up in the sight of it all. This wasn't a corporate mission statement. It was redemption, painted in human colors. She walked over to Ethan between sessions. You've built something good, she said. He looked around. We built it. She paused, then said quietly, No. I helped fund it. You lit the match. He met her gaze, and for the first time there was no tension between them. Only truth. That evening the door creaked open just before closing time. An older man stepped in, graying beard, oil-stained hands, eyes cautious but kind. I heard you all teach people who don't know where to start, he said. That still true, if the people are pushing 60. Ethan nodded. If you're breathing, you're not too late. The man exhaled like someone who'd been holding his breath for decades. Julia stood behind Ethan, smiling softly. I think we need more chairs, she said. Later that night, Ethan walked Grace home beneath a soft drizzle. She held his hand the whole way, swinging it slightly. Daddy. Yeah. Do you think Ms. Hart likes you? He chuckled. Why would you ask that? Because she looks at you like you're the answer to a question she didn't know how to ask. Ethan stopped. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because she wasn't wrong. He bent down to tie her shoelace, buying time, then replied, Sometimes two people don't meet to complete each other. They meet to remind each other they were already whole. Grace blinked. That sounds like something Ms. Hart would write in her notebook. She probably did, he said, standing. She just hasn't read it to herself yet. Meanwhile, Julia was still at the safe house organizing files. But her eyes weren't on the screen. They were on the picture Grace had taped to the office door earlier that week. A drawing of the safe house. Ethan standing outside, arms crossed. Grace waving. And Julia in the window, smiling. Beneath it, in big block letters, some people build castles. Others build shelters. She ran her hand over the drawing, fingers trembling just a little. Then she opened her journal and wrote, I spent half my life trying to build something big enough to matter. But now I wonder if the better question was, who do I want to be when it all gets small? The next morning, the safe house had double the kids. A retired engineer showed up with a stack of Raspberry Pi kits. A local bakery sent free pastries. A news crew asked to do a feature. Julia declined. This isn't for cameras, she said. It's for kids who stopped believing someone was watching. But someone was watching. Ethan knew it. He saw it in the way the shyest girl now volunteered to explain phishing scams. In the way Louise sat straighter when Julia entered the room. In the way Grace handed out hand-labeled name tags to every newcomer like they were VIPs at a tech summit. The world hadn't changed, but something inside it had caught fire. That night, as they cleaned up, Ethan leaned against the doorframe while Julia stacked chairs. You know, he said, for someone who used to run a billion-dollar company, you stack a mean folding chair. Julia smirked. Turns out humility's a muscle. He stepped closer. Does it hurt? She looked at him, searching. losing it all. "No," she said. "It hurts more to realize how little it ever mattered." "A beat?" Then he asked quietly, and now she shrugged. "Now I'm learning to count differently." Outside, the sign flickered briefly. "Safe House" in hand-painted letters. And in that fragile light, two people stood in a room full of mismatched chairs, broken computers, and kids who didn't know they were about to rewrite the world. Together. It was Grace who found the envelope first. It had been slipped under the safe house door sometime during the night plane, white and sealed with a piece of red tape. No return address, no handwriting, just one word written in neat block letters. "Ethan." She handed it to him as he poured his morning coffee, eyes still heavy from sleep and too many late nights fixing firewalls and broken tablet screens. "You got a secret admirer?" she asked playfully. "Doubt it," he said, opening it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a line of code. Simple, elegant, encrypted. But Ethan recognized the pattern. It was his own one he had written in another life, a personal encryption signature he'd once embedded in a diagnostic shell while working under clearance. Someone had used it, someone inside the safe house, or close to it. He looked up at Grace, her wide eyes watching him. "You okay, Dad?" He smiled faintly. "Yeah, just surprised." She tilted her head. "Surprises can be good. That's what Miss Hart says." He nodded, though he wasn't sure this was the kind of surprise she meant. Later that day, Ethan pulled Julia aside during a break in the lesson schedule. The kids were in the back room giggling over password puzzles. He held up the envelope. "This show up for you, too." Julia glanced at the code. Her brow furrowed. "No, but that encryption signature. It's familiar. It should be," Ethan said. "I wrote it. Years ago. No one else has used it since I left." "Any idea who sent it?" Ethan hesitated. "Not yet, but whoever it is, they know exactly who I was before this place." Julia's eyes met his. "Maybe that's not a threat. Maybe it's a reminder." He stared at her, uncertain. Then she added softer this time. "You're not hiding anymore, Ethan. Maybe someone's letting you know. It's safe to be seen again." That night, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, old laptop, humming, decrypting the string. He fed the code line through a decoder he hadn't used in nearly a decade. The screen blinked once, then displayed a message. "For every system you protect, there's one you're still building. Trust it." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning. It was a truth, and it hit harder than anything else could have. Because for the first time since the day he buried his wife, Ethan realized something terrifying. He had stopped building for himself. He had only been fixing, reacting, holding up the walls. But now, someone believed he was ready to design again. The next morning, Julia arrived earlier than usual. She found Ethan on the roof, his sketchpad in hand. She tilted her head. "You sketch?" "Now." He nodded. "Used to. A long time ago." "What is it?" she asked. He turned the pad toward her. It wasn't code, it was architecture. A new safe house, larger, wider, open windows, solar panels, multi-purpose labs, reading nooks, garden rooftops, spaces designed for kids who needed more than knowledge, they needed dignity. Julia studied it for a long time. "You thinking of expanding?" Ethan shrugged. "I'm thinking of planting. Something real. Something that grows after we're gone." She handed the sketch back to him. "That's what legacy should look like. Not skyscrapers, safe places." He smiled. "You think people will invest in it?" She laughed. "If they don't, I will. I've already burned one empire. Might as well build something worth keeping this time." That evening, Grace insisted they all stay late to celebrate Luis's birthday. Julia baked a cake from a box. Ethan lit candles with a lighter he hadn't used since his wedding day. The kids sang loudly, off-key, beautifully imperfect. Afterwards, they all sat around in a circle telling stories about their lives, no prompts, just real words. Louise spoke up. I used to think people like me were just passengers. Like we didn't get to touch the wheel. But here, I don't know. I feel like maybe I could drive something someday. Ethan nodded, his voice thick. You were never just a passenger. You were waiting for someone to hand you the keys. The kids clapped. Grace whispered something to Julia. Julia's eyes widened. Then she leaned over to Ethan and said with a grin, "She just asked if you and I were going to get married so she could finally wear a dress with glitter." Ethan laughed deeply. She's not subtle. Julia looked at him, eyes soft. Neither are you. Not anymore. Later, that night, the three of them walked home under the stars. Grace in the middle, holding both their hands. No words were spoken. They didn't need to be. Because somewhere between the cracks of what they had lost and the flickers of what they were still building, something sacred had started to take root. Not just trust, not just purpose, but love, the kind born not of grand gestures but of quiet choices, the kind that heals without demanding applause. Inside the safe house, taped to the whiteboard, Grace had drawn a new sign. Beneath the painted logo in big blue letters, "Heartware installed." The first snow came quietly that year. No announcement, no fanfare, just a hush falling over the city like a white breath held too long. It blanketed the sidewalk, softened the edges of buildings, and wrapped the safe house in something that felt like memory. Ethan stood by the front door, hot cocoa in one hand, the other resting on Grace's shoulder. She was staring through the frosted window at the children decorating the tree in the lobby, paper stars, recycled circuit boards, and a single gold ornament that read, "You are safe here." Behind them, the smell of cinnamon and pine mingled with the low hum of laughter and holiday jazz playing softly from a second-hand speaker. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. Julia arrived just after sunset, brushing snow from her coat as she entered. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair tousled her presence, quiet but steady like someone who had finally found her pace after years of sprinting. Ethan looked up and smiled. "You're late. I brought cookies," she said, holding up a tin with an overly festive bow. "Forgiven." Grace ran up and hugged her without hesitation. Julia knelt eye level with the girl. "Are you ready for tonight?" Grace nodded. "We practiced. She's giving the welcome speech," Ethan said. "Refused to let anyone else do it." "She gets that from her father," Julia murmured, ruffling Grace's hair. The main room of the safe house had been transformed. Strings of mismatched lights lined the walls, folding chairs arranged into neat rows, and a banner hung crookedly above the projector screen that read, "Safe House Winter Gathering, to build is to belong." People began to pour in, students, families, neighbors, even former hardcore employees who'd quietly joined the mentoring program. The room buzzed with warmth, the kind that didn't come from thermostats. It came from remembrance, from forgiveness, from what had been earned, not given. Grace stepped up to the small wooden podium, a microphone borrowed from the local community center. She cleared her throat, once then spoke not shyly but with certainty. "Welcome to the Safe House. My name is Grace Cole, and this place started with a really good man who didn't want anyone else to feel like they had to fix the world alone." Silence. Then the kind of applause that isn't just about sound, it's about gratitude. Julia wiped a tear. Ethan did too, but turned slightly so only she could see. Later in the evening, they gathered in a circle. Kids shared wins, first passwords they built, first websites, first moments they felt seen. One girl spoke about how she used to think firewalls were for keeping people out. Now she knew they're for protecting what matters. A boy added, "My dad says I talk different now, like I know where I'm going." Another, "I told my brother not to steal games anymore." He listened. Small victories, sacred ones. As the evening wound down, Ethan walked outside for air. Snowflakes caught in his beard, melting slow. Julia joined him, gloved hands in her pockets. "You know, she said there was a time I thought the only thing I'd be remembered for was how much money I could raise." Ethan looked at her steady. Now you'll be remembered for something that won't fit in a ledger." She smiled. "You always know how to say the thing I needed to hear 5 years ago. Guess I showed up late." She shook her head. "No," she whispered. "You showed up right on time." They stood in silence for a moment, the kind that only lives between people who've bled and built beside each other. Then Julia pulled something from her coat pocket, a small, weathered USB. "Is that?" He raised an eyebrow. She nodded. "Your original trace file? From that night. The one that started all this. Why'd you keep it?" She placed it in his hand. "Because when you find the moment everything changes, you don't throw it away. You honor it." Back inside, Grace had fallen asleep in a beanbag chair clutching a book titled Cyber Heroes Stories for Brave Kids. Julia pulled a blanket over her. Ethan turned off the projector. The lights dimmed. The room quieted. And yet something inside them both glowed. Not from the tree, not from the tech, but from the unspoken knowing that they had taken what was broken and piece by fragile piece turned it into something that could shelter others. A safe house, yes, but also a home. As they locked up for the night, Ethan paused at the door. He looked back once more, then turned to Julia and said, "You know, we never really finished that conversation." She tilted her head. "Which one?" "The one about what comes next." She smiled. "Then let's not finish it. Let's live it." And together, not as CEO and security guard, not as survivors of a system, but as builders of something better, they stepped into the snow. Not to start over, but to keep going, hand in hand, home. And the beginning of everything that matters. And that was the story of Safe House. A story not just about code betrayal or redemption, but about what it means to stand up when no one else is watching, to protect, to rebuild, and to believe that even the quietest voices can change everything. I'd love to hear from you. Where in the world are you watching? From what part of this story spoke to you the most? Drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if this story moved you even just a little, please consider subscribing to the channel. We're building a community here, one story at a time, and your support means the world. Thank you for watching. Thank you for feeling. And above all, thank you for believing that kindness, integrity, and love still matter. Until the next story, stay safe, stay human, and never stop showing up.